The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says the main message from clean energy companies at the recent COP26 summit was to implement emerging technologies to help reach emissions targets. The government is promising $500 million for investment in such technologies today, hoping the Clean Energy Finance Corporation can manage the fund. Mr Morrison says the government is clearing the way for investment in the sector.
When I was speaking to the clean tech entrepreneurs and financiers in Glasgow, I said, what can we do? They didn't ask for subsidies. There was no wasn't a rent-seeking fiesta, not at least at that occasion. It was simply, can you please ensure that when we develop these technologies and we seek to establish manufacturing and we seek to do all these things, that we're not going to get tied up in all of these approval processes that put costs onto these things that don't have to be there.
One of the technologies on the government's agenda is carbon capture and storage. Professor Ahmed Abdullah is from the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering faculty at Carleton University. He says carbon capture technologies have a track record of failure.
Carbon capture is a term for a cluster of technologies that take the carbon dioxide that you emit from an electric power plant or from an industrial facility, compress it into a pipeline, and then store it safely underground in areas that have been characterized extensively and where storage has been deemed to be safe. So it's not one single thing, it's a range of technologies.
Okay, and what's the track record so far for using this particular technology to reduce emissions?
The track record, I'm afraid, globally is overwhelmingly one of failure. The technology is rather complicated. It takes an enormous amount of money to get most of the large facilities off the ground. And the reasons for failure are varied. So you really need to dig deeply into the context for each individual site to discover why it failed.
So the government has plans to invest $500 million of its own money in this and wants the private sector to also chip in the same amount, $500 million. Are you doubtful then with this, as you say, track record of failure for carbon capture and storage, that the government is going to attract the private investment that's required to meet its target to reduce emissions in this way if the business model doesn't stack up?
I am doubtful in the sense that it's not the number. 500 million is still less than the price tag of some of the more expensive projects, many of the more expensive projects, actually. So it's more about building an environment that would sustainably attract that financing further downstream. And in some sense, you need to pay less attention to the check that you're writing for the initial projects and more to the ecosystem that you're building to attract that funding later on. Will the investors think it's credible enough to put their own money, or will debtors be happy to give you the money to finance not the first facility or the first 10, but the first 50 or 100?
So which other emerging technologies then have had a better success rate than carbon capture and storage?
The renewables, because that policy environment did emerge, and I'm not talking specifically about the Australian experience here, although Australia has been quite successful in deploying some of them, but globally, the supply chains oriented quickly around solar power and now around lithium-ion batteries. Wind power was phenomenally successful before solar. So the smaller modular technologies, which could be standardized and where the policy support was credible enough, did manage to succeed more than the larger technologies that have to be built out in the field, as it were, like nuclear or carbon capture.
Okay, can you give us an example of countries where that has worked and is working?
So the United States has successfully deployed some carbon capture, as has Canada. I should say that the situation in the United States and Canada is very state-specific or province-specific. So in those provinces that were willing to, for example, match federal government funding or ease regulatory permitting, those projects can get off the ground. I should also caution that just because a project succeeds when it comes to carbon capture, it doesn't mean the capture will be permanent. For example, one of the successful projects in the US ceased operation once oil prices fell, and it became unprofitable to capture the carbon for oil recovery.
So overall, Ahmed, these are early days in these technologies, aren't they? Isn't it inevitable that there will be missteps along the way? But we are heading in the right direction, albeit by process of trial and error.
Yes, and we need much more of that trial and error. So I applaud the experimentation with business models, as you said, but also with research and development at the more fundamental level. There will be missteps, and we need to be clear about this. And I feel like citizens, the public, is aware of this. They have to be. And I should say that the record of failure is not limited to energy technologies, certainly not to carbon capture. All industrial mega projects face serious challenges: bridges, tunnels, rail. These are, I'm afraid, ubiquitous problems.
Dr. Ahmed Abdullah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.